We ready? Should we do it? Swear. We good? All right, thank you very much. Welcome back. Yep. All right, that's all right. Let him figure the phone thing out first. All right, thank you very much. Welcome back. Please be seated. We're going to talk again. We talked a little bit earlier about the intersection of sustainability and climate and social justice and building more equitable society. And we're going to continue on that theme in our final session today. We have actually an Innovation IdeaLab first. We have a remote correspondent who will be dialing in from the White House. Ai-jen Poo was here last night and was here this morning until she got a call from President Obama. And unfortunately, she said we were more important, but apparently she's on a plane and is now there, speaking with him about the subject of immigration, which you might have heard is a bit of a controversial subject here in Washington these days. But I'm sure she'll settle it. And actually, we'll get an update from her right there. And she'll do her we hope, if she's done with the president, she'll give us a phone version of her PowerPoint. So she'll be last on the list because we're waiting for her to emerge. So we'll begin with Andrew Winston, who corrected me. I said, so you talk about corporations being altruistic. He said, no, it's not altruism at all. It's about money. It's about money. There is money to be made in being green. And with that, we'll turn it over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm on. Good. Good afternoon. I know it's been a long, in a good way, long day of really interesting talks. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me. Thank you, Miles, for the introduction. Of course, the president asked me to come today, but I told him no. I mean, I said I've got important things to do here. So I guess that gives us a little more time. So we're starting now. You can start my minutes now. All right. So I think that was a good introduction. That's the really, really quick version of all the work that I do, is helping companies see the value in what people call sustainability. I'm not going to probably use that word much again. I prefer to talk about the actual challenges we face and the actual solutions, and not just kind of put a big bucket around it. But I'm going to talk to you about my newest book, mainly the ideas in my new book, The Big Pivot, and the story that I'm telling, which is the challenges we're facing are very large around the world and in the business community, and the solutions need to be large too, that we need to shift how we do business in a very fundamental way. Let me start from kind of a different place, though. So an old friend of mine is a cardiologist, and he told me something that really shocked me, that 40% of first heart attacks are fatal. Now, for many people, it's a surprise, right? Total surprise. But for a lot, there were warning signs. There was diabetes or obesity or just family history. People do react to these warning signs. They change their lives. In Men's Health magazine, there's this story they run regularly called the Belly Off Club. Fun way of pointing out people that have made some deep changes, like this man, Tom Larson. He lost 150 pounds. And every one of these stories has what the magazine describes as the wake-up call, that pivotal moment when the man realized something needed to change. You know, he was running around after his kids and was out of breath, or his doctor just said flat out, you're going to die soon. So people do change, right? They can change, sometimes dramatically. They do what's necessary to thrive. Now, I believe that we, as a business community and as a species, are getting wake-up calls, very serious wake-up calls. And the question is, are we going to listen? The first wake-up call is, more extremes. Extreme weather, droughts, floods, storms. Last year in January, Australia had to add 2 color bands to their weather maps to reflect temperatures 50 to 54 degrees centigrade, which for all Americans, as you, I'm sure, instantly know, is 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Right, that's hot. 2 Januaries in a row, this is what it was like. And I turned to Stephen Colbert for insight and analysis, and he said something I loved, which is, that's in January. Imagine what it's like in the summer. Now, this is a really educated audience, because I speak... There's a lot of times where I get a lot of laughs, and I think people are just laughing because everyone else is laughing, and then I have to kind of explain that it is summer in January. But if you don't laugh, you cry, as someone once said wisely. But, kidding aside, the story on climate change, I don't think this is a room full of people that I need to explain that there is a problem here. I spend most of my time speaking to the business community, which is ambivalent in many ways, sometimes hostile. but the story, and the way I think that we need to talk about it now, is maybe not to have a scientific debate over and over again, is just to point out that the voices coming at us around this topic now are shifting. And we're getting a different set of people talking about it. So there was a study a few months ago, the Risky Business Report. How many people here saw that or read it? This is a pretty educated crowd, you know, on this field. This was an amazing study. I think it's a great document. It came from Mayor Bloomberg, you know, who dealt with Hurricane Sandy. It came from her former U.S. Treasury Secretaries Paulson, Republican, Goldman guy, and Rubin, Democrat. And they said, basically, this is already costing us billions. That was one of the key messages I took from it, that this isn't about models and future predictions. This is now. And we've also got another interesting arm of the world saying this, which is the Pentagon. For 4 years now, they've been saying that climate change is actually a security threat. But what they added to their language lately was immediate. It's immediate threat, now. So this is now a concern. We are now living in a hotter, more volatile world. Now, luckily, I think there is some indication of response to it. Did anybody go to the march? There were marches all over the world. I was there with my family. I was marching with my clients, Unilever, and their Ben & Jerry's team. This is their melting ice cream cone. These are my kids. And this is actually my 8-year-old with Ben & Jerry, which was fun. I learned that Jerry's a hugger. That was kind of nice. He's kind of a bear of a man. You know, this is a good sign. Hundreds of thousands of people, but, and this is no criticism to, I think, the media here, a lot of the media kind of missed this story. They didn't cover it very much, considering how big a march this really was and how global it was. We're also seeing some real reactions now, finally. This announcement last week from the 2 presidents of the biggest countries in the world was a big deal. The agreement on climate wasn't as far as we need to go, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but it was a big deal. It signaled to the world that we're ready to have a real discussion about limits on carbon. So we're living in a hotter world, but we are starting to wake up to that, painfully. The second wake-up call, though, is a rise in the price of kind of everything, a new kind of scarcity. In 1 year, China built 17 billion square feet of new space. So I want you to picture Manhattan, all of the commercial property in Manhattan. In that 1 year, China built not 1 commercial Manhattan, but 30. Yeah. Half the steel, aluminum, and cement in the world are in China. And the one that keeps me up at night, half the pigs are in China. They bought Smithfield Foods last year. They need more pigs. As they get richer, they eat more. We heard earlier about the effect of meat, the multiplier effect of meat. These are huge impacts, right? And what this means is something very basic. I got an economics degree in college, and I had to draw supply and demand over and over again. That's how you get an economics degree. It's really basic to me. The demand is rising relentlessly, and the access to cheap resources is pretty much done. 7, 8, 9 billion people means more demand, not enough supply. And so what you see is a deep change in how the world works. This is data from McKinsey. This is adding up all of the things that we call commodities, which just means the stuff going into life and our economy, metals, energy, food, and putting it all in one basket. The average price of that basket for 100 years dropped with, volatility for little problems like world wars, right? We got more efficient. That's how modern business grew up. But what's happened this century is a deep change. In 10 years, we wiped out all the productivity of 100 years. Things are literally more expensive than ever. There's a couple important caveats, like natural gas with fracking, right? But most things are getting more expensive consistently. This is a different world for business. It means we have to get leaner as a country and as companies. So we're living in a scarcer world, but we're also living in a more connected world in a very real way. Every minute, there's a couple million comments on Facebook. Every hour, we upload 6,000 hours of video to YouTube, and only 3,000 hours of that is cat-related. The others is, other is about us. Almost, half a billion tweets a day. There's tweets going on right now. How many people have a teenager? Wow, that's a lot. The typical American teenager texts 4,000 times a month. You can do the math. I asked my 17-year-old niece, does that sound right? She's like, yeah, it's about right. And then she texted me, But these millennials, these young people, can come together. It's not just connection for connection's sake. We can do something with that. We've heard some great stories today that are similar. This is Sarah Kavanaugh, who's 17 now. When she was 15, she started a change.org petition that asked for a change in the formula of sodas that were using a brominated ingredient that people had some concerns about. So Coke and Pepsi both changed their formula. So they don't even need a march. A millennial needs a computer. It's a deep change. And this connection, this ability to gather data, to ask questions, means that Everything that any company does, anywhere in their supply chain, is open to public scrutiny. You have questions being raised about where does stuff come from? We can ask it now about every product. Where did it come from? Who made it? Were they paid a living wage? What's the carbon footprint? Is there a toxic chemical in this? These are the questions that businesses are asking of each other, even more than we as consumers are. We're kind of lagging in a lot of ways. So this hotter, scarcer, more open world creates risk, but it also creates enormous opportunity. My favorite billionaire entrepreneur, because just putting those two words together is fun, has said that tackling the climate economy, the clean economy, is the greatest wealth-generating opportunity of our time. And I think it's obvious. Multi-trillion-dollar markets are in play here. Buildings, transportation, energy, consumer products, finance, all in play. Deep change is coming. And so that's why I wrote this book in a lot of ways. I said if we have this level of challenge, a fundamental change in how the world works, and existential threats coming our way, then we need to change how business operates. And I just found out, I have to brag a little, I just found out last week that Strategy in Business named my book one of the 7 of the best business books of the year. And it was great, but the other 6 are selling a lot more copies. So if you guys could do something about that. One of them was Piketty's book, Capital, which everybody's buying and no one can read because it's 800 pages. Mine's like a third of that length. So I figure, And then I had this cover story in April in Harvard Business Review, and I'll talk about kind of themes of that. So what's the big pivot? I have 10 kind of key strategies, because 10 is always the right number. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. There's kind of 3 big buckets. First is a change in vision, how we see the world, really fundamentally as business leaders and as people, about short and long-term thinking, about how we set our goals based on science, which I think this crowd would like, and that's what I'm going to spend more of my time on. And then how we innovate, what I call heretical innovation, asking different questions, very fundamental disruptive questions. Second, there's a change in valuation, meaning not value like ethics, but how we put numbers on things in business so that we measure the actual value, not the altruistic value, not the value to society, but the value to the business. But we're bad at measuring some things, and so the way we use return on investment and other tools is broken. And then finally, we need to partner in a different way. You can take a picture. The book's only like $18, though. I see someone picked. Go for it. I'm just saying you can get the whole framework for like 18. It's awesome. The partner pivot is about who we work with and how we work together. We have to work with government differently, pressure government for the environment, for climate change action, and that's not what business normally does very well. We have to partner with each other within business in new ways that are kind of a radical form of collaboration. And we have to partner with our own customers differently. Ask them to do something different. In the end, this is about building resilience. This is the hot new word now, resilience. And I think there's a good reason we're focusing on this. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, I live in Connecticut, southern Connecticut. We got hit hard. New York got hit really hard, and Jersey demolished, right? We learned how fragile we are. The seas rushed into lower Manhattan, and a part of the electric grid, a transponder, exploded, plunging the heart of the financial world into darkness for 4 days. Now, call me crazy, but I think if your electric grid explodes when it gets wet, it's not resilient. It's not very flexible, right? So we're learning that we need to get rid of old technologies, move away from ancient fuels. Europe has woken up to the kind of painful fact that 1/3 of their coal, oil, and natural gas comes from this man. This is my favorite picture of a world leader ever. So this is why you see Germany and Switzerland and others trying to move to renewables very quickly. This is one of the reasons. And it's why they've been really quiet on the Ukraine. They're beholden, right? That's not resilient. They were not resilient to Hurricane Putin, as I like to call it. But companies are realizing this too. Walmart is the largest buyer of renewable energy in the country, besides the military. And when they announced last year they would increase that already large purchase by another 600%, one of the top executives said something really interesting to me. It was kind of a core element of what I'm talking about. This helps us keep our stores up and running, no matter what else is going on, no matter what the weather is. This is a kind of competitive advantage form of resilience. This is, we can sell more stuff because we're flexible, right? And by the way, it's at zero cost to the business. Walmart spends not a penny more for the green power, as they call it, versus the brown power. They use what's called a power purchasing agreement. How many people know what that is? I love this crowd. This is great. Because I talk to most business people, and I'm telling you, I have clients, I work with executives across big companies. I'll talk to the head of energy, and they don't know what it is. It's remarkable to me. But what it is, for those who don't know, is a way of basically buying power per kilowatt hour. You lease your roof, you rent, you basically let someone build solar on your roof, and you pay for the power like you would with the utility. and you pay the same. This is all possible now. We don't need futuristic technologies. We can move much, much quicker. So let me talk about the vision and very, very little bit about the other two, but I'm going to mainly talk about the vision stuff. So I'll just say quickly that the short-term plague on business is a very real problem. It's kind of the core hurdle in all of this. It's not about that we have to think about the societal value. It's that we're so bad at thinking beyond the quarter anymore. And the market has shifted dramatically. It is not what it used to be. Over half the shares are now bought and sold in less than the blink of an eye, in milliseconds. Over half. So how can that be about fundamental value? Right, it can't. So you have some CEOs, a very few, kind of realizing this and pushing back and saying, I'm not going to talk to you quarterly. Paul Pullman at Unilever has done this. Tim Cook at Apple's had some similar tough conversations with investors. But it's a very tough issue, and I'm not, I could go into it for longer, but I think just as a context. But second, one of the ways to fight this is that we need to set our goals differently. Companies set goals bottom up. They ask everybody kind of what they think they can do in a division. How, do you think you can cut energy this much or waste that much? Now, but imagine we were all in a boat and it was filling with water. What we would not do is ask everyone, hey, how much do you think you can bail today? How much do you feel like bailing? And then set like a stretch target or something. No, I mean, we would figure out what we need to bail to stay afloat. We'd have to work back from reality. And we know on many issues what the numbers are now. I work in partnership with PwC, and they have this great report every year, the Low Carbon Economy Index. It is a great short report. Every year they calculate, given the IPCC numbers, how fast we need to go. And we need to cut carbon in our economy 6% per year. It's now actually 6.2%, because every year you miss a target, it gets harder. And some research I did, I have a publicly available website called pivotgoals.com that has 4,000 goals in it, a database you can search of the biggest companies' goals around social and environmental things. And surprisingly to me, actually, when we did an analysis on it, 50 of the largest 200 companies in the world do have a goal that meets this pace, roughly, for some big part of their business, a big renewable energy goal or a big greenhouse gas cut goal. And it has affected how some companies do business. Ford, kind of most famously to me, started building their vehicles or setting their product development strategy based on the science of climate change. That's kind of amazing. It's been doing it for years, and they announced at the beginning of this year, because of this strategy, that the Ford F-150 truck for 2015 would be 700 pounds lighter because they're moving from steel to aluminum. This is risky, heretical work, right? This is their number one selling vehicle, most profitable, and it's Ford Tough, that's the brand, and they're lightening it. So this is heresy to say, hey, can we change the fundamental nature of one of our products? It's not a deep heresy as others. Tesla's the hottest car company in the world. They're asking why we need an internal combustion engine at all. Right? That's the kind of question they can ask. So we can ask heretical questions in business running from how do we operate all the way up to the whole business. People know the story of UPS. They don't take left turns in cities. Do people know this? It's been going on. It's an old story in a way, but basically using GPS software to avoid left turns where you're idling. You're wasting time, energy, and money just sitting at a light. They take right turns, and they're saving 85 million miles, 8 million gallons. It's a great story. They save money. But to me, it's about culture and heresy. I want you to imagine that first meeting where someone said, why don't we stop taking left turns? Who's with me? All right. So there are some deep heresies. I've been told I have 2 minutes left. There's a great story about Adidas and Nike. They're doing stuff with waterless technology. There's a lot more behind it, but it's a great idea, which is why do we need water to dye clothes? It turns out we don't. We use a ton of water around the world, but I want to end with a couple quick stories. CVS Health, I think, is one of the most amazing business stories this year. They said, we're not going to sell tobacco. This is a big pivot, right? Because they asked, can we stop selling products that don't fit our strategy or mission of improving people's health? Are there things we should stop doing? Are there things we should do more of? Kingfisher is the Home Depot of Europe. They've said they want to help people build buildings that generate more energy than they use. That's a regenerative business model, and it's good for business. So there's stuff we should do more of. And it's possible. This is a building in Seattle where I just flew from last night, which is why they let me talk a little later today. Thank you so much. I'll skip this. It's about policy. You guys know about Ceres in Boston, Bicep. Lots of changes going on and companies asking for policy change. And you got companies working together across normal competitive lines. Coke works with Pepsi on refrigerants. This is the fiercest rivalry in business history. Can we collaborate with our competitors? Yes, on big shared challenges. So finally, though, I just want to point out that there are companies trying to tie what they do to a larger purpose, something deeper, like bringing energy and water to parts of the world. We heard stories like this today. or trying to solve health crises. Unilever, you heard about kids dying under 5. Unilever has a hand washing campaign to help kids survive. Now, this sounds like philanthropy, and I said at the beginning, this isn't altruism. Of course there's an element of doing the right thing, but if you take a kind of cold, hard business look at it, there is a business logic to it. If kids don't survive till the age of 5, if they don't grow up, they can't be members of society, they can't be employees, they can't be customers. If people don't have energy and water, they're not going to buy computers or buy detergent. Like, it sounds awful, but the core idea is that business can't thrive unless society and the planet thrive as well. They're not separate. They're not disconnected. It's a very strange thing we're taught in business school, that we have this control over everything. We're all deeply connected. So I ask everyone I talk to, business audiences, everyone, what are you going to do to challenge the way we normally do things? To deal with the scale of the challenges we're facing and the opportunities. Because we need everyone to ask different questions. What's your heresy? And what if our future and our lives depended on the answer? Because they do. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right, so while we wait word from the White House, we will shift the order here slightly. We're going to bring up Gar Alperovitz, and with the provocative question of what then must we do, which is the title of his book. And we're going to hear a little bit about sharing the spoils of good times and bad, I guess.
Right, thank you. They put me last, so they also suggest that the last speaker tends to wind up and kind of cover the waterfront and comment on everything. So that fits in with what I want to do in any case. But I want to say that all the companies we just heard about, those are the good guy companies, and we like what they're doing. And the other kind of things I'm going to raise are discussions going on in 3 different areas. One is a sense that's going on in many parts of the country and in parts of the business community and in large parts of the academic community and among people who look at Washington and say the whole damn thing is broken. One way to look at it is the most looked up words in the Webster Merriam dictionary last year, 2 years ago, were capitalism and socialism. The discussion that's gone on when they ask people under 30, which word do you like better, capitalism or socialism, just slightly more like socialism in America today. The people who ask about rating big corporations, on balance, the numbers have gone steadily up over the last 30 years of really anger at the corporations. Something is going on, but the most interesting part of it for me was I was asked to come to a major conference of the Academy of Management. Do you all know what that is? 29,000 business advisors, corporate advisors, business school professors last summer to give one of the keynotes. The topic was, is capitalism over? This is the business community. And what do we do about it? And how do you achieve sustainability? And the argument that was presented, not by me, but presented by the people who put the manifesto down, the leaders of the Academy of Management, was that there are problems that can't be solved within capitalism, and that the business community needs to face that and begin to debate what to do about it. So we're beginning to see that kind of evidence, and if I had time, I'd give you all sorts of evidence of people beginning to say we face a systemic crisis, not a political crisis. Now, what does that mean? Let me give you some data. I didn't do PowerPoints because I knew I was going to be last, and so I just brought some old-fashioned professorial numbers to bring to bear. Over the last 35 years, that's Republicans controlling the White House and Democrats back and forth, the distribution of income has gotten worse year by year by year. Doesn't much matter who's in office. The top 1% has gone from 10% of the income to 22% of the income in that period. The bottom 98, 99% have lost that income. Poverty levels have gone steadily up. Incarceration rates, particularly for black people, have gone worst in the nation. They're bobbled around a little bit lately because there's some concern about the costs of prisons, but by and large, the trend for 35 years has gone up. We imprison 8 times as many per capita as Russia. We are the worst in the world by far, by 7 times as much as most nations. The black and brown composition of that gets worse and worse year by year. If you look at wealth distribution, the top, and this is a number that people kind of get interested in. There's some other numbers that are really interesting as well, but this is one that I particularly find audiences understand. The top 400 people 400 people. Easily get them in this room. Have more wealth now than the bottom 180 million people taken together in the United States. That's the reality. That's a medieval reality, technically speaking, not in rhetoric. I'm sorry, actually that's wrong, because a medieval historian came up to me after one of the conversations when I gave that data, and he said, it was never quite that bad in medieval times. I think that's accurate. So I could give you data of this kind on virtually every major trend. Until very recently, the CO2 numbers have been that way too. There's been some change because of fracking and because of the slowdown of the recession. But by and large, the numbers for a long period, many people here know those numbers better than I. So if you look at almost every major indicator, there has been a 30 to 40-year decline in the things that matter most to most people. The data I really want to find a number, give you some numbers on, because these are kind of these are the ones that are shocking to me. This is comparative data of where your country stands in the world today, given the political economic power relationships we now have. Life expectancy, this is compared with all advanced systems, and mostly OECD, but all advanced systems. Life expectancy, we are 21 out of 21. Mental health care, 19th out of 21. Infant mortality, 21 out of 21. Maternal mortality, 21 out of 21. Obesity, 19 out of 19. Income inequality, 21 out of 21. Poverty, 21 out of 21. If we measured poverty the way every other country measures it, you would find the numbers that you get from Washington just about, not quite doubled. The number is a bureaucratic monster. It was invented by a bureaucrat, young woman named Molly Orshansky, who said, take the food budget of an average poor person, multiply it by 3, and that's poverty. It has no statistical meaning. Most parts of the world, in fact, every other part of the world in the advanced systems, half of the median is what's regarded as the poverty line. If we use that number today, we would have 70 million people in poverty, which is the measure by every other country. I'm not trying to get you unhappy, but I want to try to get you to the question of what is it we're talking about, and how do the wonderful, wonderful projects and some of the wonderful things parts of the business community are doing fit into a longer-term reality that is somewhat different from, I think, the hopes and fears of many people in this room. I'll just give you a few more. Gender gap, 19th out of 21. Child poverty, 21 out of 21. Gender in politics, 20 out of 21. Public social spending, 17 out of 21. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Math scores, 20 out of 21. Science scores, 15 out of 21. Environmental index, 20 out of 21. We are near the bottom on virtually every major indicator that's going on in the advanced industrial world. Along with that, Washington is bottlenecked and stuck. So people are beginning to understand or raise the question, are we facing not a political problem? I should say, I spent a lot of time in Washington. I ran House and Senate staffs, and I was an insider doing policy planning in the State Department. Been there, done that. One of the things that's changed over the last 30 years is what we do politically is clearly not making much of an impact on the outcome trends. People sense that. They know Washington is stuck. They know that many of the exciting things that are possible don't impact trend. That is the nature of a systemic crisis, not a political crisis. Now, what in the world do you do with a systemic crisis? How do you actually first confront that idea, and secondly, begin to ask questions about where do we go, how do we proceed? And that's what's been very interesting to me, because it's not only that the Academy of Management is asking those questions, but we've been finding around the country large numbers of people are beginning to ask that set of questions in different ways. And there's a group of academics primarily, but it includes the president of the Political Science Association, last year's 2 of them actually, 3 years ago, president of the American Sociological Association, president of the Academy of Management, and a series of environmentalists from Bill McKibben to Julie Shore and to Gus Speth, some of you may know. Gus and I have been co-chairing this project. It's called the Next System Project. How do we start an informed, thoughtful realistic discussion of if capitalism in its form doesn't work to alter trend because the power relationships are such that trend doesn't alter, and if socialism certainly doesn't work to alter trend except in the wrong direction in our experience, how do we actually begin to get serious to think about what would be the system, the next system, that would begin to honor American values of liberty, democracy, community, general ecological sustainability, which is a major, major issue involved in all this, and how would you actually begin to open that question? Now, that's a very nasty thing to drop in the lap of a wonderful kind of conversation of the kind we've had so far today, and the extraordinary things that are being done. But it poses the issue of how does the exciting work that's being done begin to impact and develop trend possibilities. And I think the only way to think about that, and it's hard for some people and not for others, is to ask yourself, what must it have been like in the decade before the women's movement got going? Some of you older folks, none of the younger, will know that. The idea in my mother's generation that women could take on the roles that my daughter, who's a physician, take on, that was possible. You couldn't actually sign for a house. You couldn't get a checking account. You couldn't get a banking account. The notion that you could challenge that and achieve the greatest cultural revolution in really modern history, the feminist revolution, that was impossible. Or put yourself in mind of what it was like before the civil rights movement became a civil rights movement. Or I happened to run, when I worked in the Senate, I was legislative director to a guy named Gaylord Nelson. Some of you may know the founder of Earth Day, one of the great environmental senators of the time. What was it like before environmentalism became environmentalism? It used to be conservation, then it became an environmental issue, and then it became an ecological issue. How did that progression occur, and how do we develop that? So if you are willing to be with me for a minute and throw 3 decades on the table and think that way, I think you begin to kind of get to the place where people like the ones I mentioned who have been talking about a next system project, where their thinking is. What are the elements we're beginning to see in all these wonderful projects? What other things are going on in the economy? What could be done as the crisis deepens? So let me say a word about as the crisis deepens, because in some ways that's the driver of what we're experiencing. It's not only the stalemate in Washington. These trends have gone on for 30, 35 years, give or take. So it's not just the political crisis. It is partly the income distribution and the power relationship crisis that's been driving these trends. What would it be possible? How could you begin to alter trends of that scope and scale? Now, I'm a historian, so forgive me. Revolutions are as common, evolutionary changes as common as grass in world history. That's the way it happens very often in different parts of the world. The Berlin Wall fell, the apartheid fell, the American Revolution happened, big things happen in history. We don't frame ourselves that way. We don't think, what would it be like if we began thinking about developments as the pain level deepens and as the stagnation deepens? You've got a political stalemate, you've got trends going on, you've got Paul Krugman and Larry Summers and many other economists, including this one, saying we are in an era of deepening stagnation. What does that mean? It means it isn't going to go up and it isn't going to crash. It's just going to get decaying. That argument, we could get into what secular stagnation is. What does a long period like that do? And how does one begin to think about fundamental change? One answer is nothing can be done. Most people secretly think that. That is a possibility. It's a logical possibility. It's helpful to get it on the table and talk about it directly and think about it. Another is that slowly experiments of the kind we're talking about, but particularly in the economic sphere, some I'm going to talk to you a little bit about with time available, slowly begin to generate different paradigms, different political possibilities, and different expanding possibilities that point in another direction. So if you want to come back with me, if you don't want to be before the beginning of the feminist revolution or the civil rights revolution or the environmental revolution, go back to the 20 years before the New Deal. See if you can get yourself in that space. Virtually every major thing that happened in the New Deal was incubated in the so-called state and local laboratories of democracy. That's where Social Security came from. That's where the labor laws came from. That's where the welfare programs came from. They were fragments that boiled up in cities and states around the country at a time when it seemed impossible to make things happen. And then an opening came, and the people began looking around, as Milton Friedman said, for the ideas lying around. And where they were being incubated at the state and local level. One of the things we've been doing, and part of the work that we've been doing at the Democracy Collaborative, which is an organization that I'm part of, is looking at and helping set loose different forms that change the ownership and development of wealth, productive wealth, practical things, particularly in communities. And it's not simply about who gets to own the wealth. And here's a question. I've been listening all day. We haven't heard the word power, political power. So this is about institutions not only change wealth distribution, but political power and the power that comes with wealth distribution. So this is one way to begin asking, is anything going on in that direction? Well, one way to look at it, when I worked in the Senate, one of the most interesting things was labor and environmentalists fought over projects. They were at each other's necks. And they worked to elect liberal Democrats, who then passed environmental legislation. Very odd. Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day, one of the leading environmentalists, was a labor lawyer. One of the problems we face in the traditional policy realm, and why it's a systemic crisis, not just a political crisis, is labor's gone from 34.5% of the labor force organized at the peak, 1953. It's now down to 11.6. It's less than 7% in the private sector and is decaying before your eyes as a political institutional power base for the kinds of things most people would like to see generalized in this room. That's another way to think about a systemic crisis, not a straight political crisis. It means that the institutions have shifted, in this case, labor unions, and now under very severe attack, also politically, but there's been an inherent quieter process, which we could go into if we have time in the questions, why that happened, partly political attack and partly changes in sectors and partly return to an earlier phase, which is kind of natural for America, of weak labor unions. At the peak, Sweden had 85% of the labor force in unions, and that's a good deal of why their social democratic politics was a lot different from ours. In any case, we ain't going back that way. So now you've got I painted you a dark picture. What is happening, and this is what's been very interesting, is there are lots and lots of experimentation going on that works at the state and local level, changing who gets to own wealth and building new institutions at the same time that begin to give politicians, particularly local at this stage, we're still in the laboratories of democracy, we're not yet at the national level, give them a new power base of some kind. At the same time the labor union trend has gone down, the number of people in worker-owned companies has gone up, almost exactly in the same direction. Almost 14 million people now in one or another form of companies owned largely or entirely by the workers in them. And some of the experimentation we're seeing is in the so-called new economy movement. I don't know how many of you know about the new economy movement, but that's under the radar in many parts of the country. Worker-owned co-ops are very, very hot right now, and they are popping up in many, many parts of the country. New York City just put a lot of money into official public money into sponsoring the development of worker-owned co-ops, and a number of mayors are beginning to pick this up in the so-called new economy movement. It is the prototypical democratic economic institution. It's not the only one, but it's the one that's very hot right now. You see developmental process going on in many parts of the country, and almost always green. Moreover, in many parts, there's beginning to be an evolution in sophistication in this kind of institution. I don't have time to give you the full story, but let me tell you about one in Cleveland. How many know about the Evergreen model? 3 or 4 people. The Evergreen model in Cleveland, which our group had something to do with, developed out of this growing process. In fact, it started 30 years ago when the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company went down and the steel workers tried to set up a worker-owned company, which failed because the Carter administration cut them down. It's a long story. They first supported them and then cut them down. But they tried to educate people in Ohio, where you see lots of worker-owned companies, partly out of that big fight, the historical 30-year process. In Cleveland, coming out of that long culture, and I don't have time to expand, and based in part on the Mondragon model, the very sophisticated models in the Basque region of Spain, 80,000 workers involved in a complex model in which the top salary in 85% of the co-ops, and they do everything major corporations do. In the top ratio is 6 to 1, bottom to top. Often it's 250 to 301, bottom to top in American corporations. In their very largest ones, it's 9 to 1. But based on that model, in part, and in sophisticated management systems and research systems, the Cleveland model is a complex of worker co-ops, in this case linked together geographically to help build a community institution to benefit the entire community in a neighborhood of 40,000, 40% unemployment, average family income 20,000, black. We haven't talked much about race either. We haven't talked much about income distribution or race or power. And here's a model that's trying to alter all three in the city of Cleveland. What they do is they set up companies, 3 of them. One of them is probably, in fact, is the largest urban greenhouse in the United States, a capacity of about 3 million heads of lettuce a year. There's a very large scale, probably the greenest industrial scale laundry serves hospitals and nursing homes and others in that area. It's in a LEED, so I think it's LEED Gold now building they're in. So all of the stuff is very green, and the third is a solar installation company. So that's the current level, and they hope to put 2 or 3 new companies into this complex each year. So that itself is interesting because it aims at building community, not just worker-owned companies, which have their own narrow interests. And secondly, and here's the feature, someone was talking about I think it was in Philadelphia, where you've been using the purchasing power of so-called anchor institutions. In the middle of this neighborhood, very poor neighborhood, is the Cleveland Clinic, Case Western Reserve University, and University Hospitals. Those 3 so-called anchor institutions, they're anchored, they can't get up and run, as some of the corporations often do, and certainly in Cleveland did. Went from 800 to 900,000 to less than 400,000 loss of population, like Detroit, only not quite as bad. Anchor institutions don't move. Those 3 alone purchase $3 billion, with a B, dollars in goods and services a year. None of it from the neighborhood. They have finally gotten this group to actually begin allocating some of their purchasing power to support these community building entities and this complex, so that you've got the use of much of that money is taxpayer money and Medicare, Medicaid, educational money. You've got a recycling to rebuild a complex with the goal of building the community, new jobs, changing the wealth ownership, democratizing the patterns, and making it the greenest elements in each of the business communities, business elements possible. So you're seeing that kind of experimentation. There's several other cities, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, Jackson, other parts of the country are trying to replicate this kind of a hot model right now. But more interesting to me is the evolution from simple model to a more complex model, and then to use planning systems that begin to stabilize. If you want to think about that at the national level, at some point we're actually going to produce mass transit systems, and we're going to put public money in it, and maybe high-speed rail. If we come, look at the Chinese, there would be contracts which would permit much larger industrial scale development and stabilize communities. We haven't talked about stabilizing communities, but it's another piece of this puzzle. You don't do much sustainability planning of any serious kind when you knock a city from 800,000 to 400,000. First, the carbon cost of replicating those buildings elsewhere is extraordinary. That is to say, houses, hospitals, roads, schools, every institution for 400,000 people is thrown away. The capital's thrown away. People don't disappear, so they go elsewhere. And then you have to rebuild the capital and the carbon costs of all of that. It's extraordinary. At the same time, you've destabilized the planning process, so it's hard to do high-density housing or mass transit in the old communities. So the movement part of this, how to stabilize communities, worker-owned companies stay put is one way to do it. There are lots of other ways. Is another piece of how you actually begin thinking about transforming the systemic base of these cities. So that's one element. I'm going to run out of time shortly. I don't know what my time is running, but let me give you just a few other things, because this is happening in different parts of the so-called new economy movement. Some cities, like probably most people know about Boulder, where the citizens took over a very strong fight in order to change the output and the climate change of the utility and make it into a public utility. There are, by the way, 25% of American electricity is produced by co-ops and public utilities already, but that's another process. Eminent domain is being in use some cities. Richmond, California is the leader there to deal with housing problems. There's a whole series of these kinds of experiments going on out of pain and out of stalemate, out of increasing, either we do it in a new way or it doesn't get done. And that's the interesting process at work. It's being driven by the crisis, and it's not a collapse, it's a decaying process. And it is open in virtually all the elements that we've seen. It is open to the excitement and thought and creative stuff we're hearing here today, merging it. It has a different spirit of what it's trying to do, but it is addressing the economic question and the economic institutional question. I'm going to come back to something I started at the beginning. That's at one level. The other level is there is an academic process involving now leaders like, of the environmental community, like Bill McKibben and Gus Speth and others who I mentioned. And I can go on, but these political science presidents, sociology presidents, academic leadership saying it is time for us to rethink what we think about models and long-term directions for this system, and getting serious about it rather than rhetorical. What really are the requirements of democracy? Can you do it with the income and wealth distribution we're talking about it? What power institutions are possible? The mayor of Cleveland looks much better in his negotiation with the companies that want to come in and then leave, because you've got another alternative building up. What are the power possibilities of building up this very American down-home sort of elements that give a new direction for the long haul? So I want to back off. My time is running out, so let me say just one or two other things. This is very hard stuff. But the hard place in it, in my experience, and I come from the inside. I did House and Senate, but also policy planning. The hard part is not about thinking about different institutions. It's not even thinking about precedents like the women's movement, the environmental movement, the revolutions that knocked down the Berlin Wall. That's not the hard part. This kind of change happens all over the world all the time. It is common as grass. The hard part, I'm talking to the person in your seat. The hard part is existential. The hard part is allowing ourselves to imagine that we can actually think this way, that it's possible for Americans to reimagine their future in a very practical and highly intellectually developed theoretical way, and begin seeing the work as, I like to use what the old Chinese expression, walk on two legs. Do whatever we can now in the old way and the reform way, to lots of pain in this world, a lot of environmental problems, regulation, good guy corporations, whatever can be done the old way, but also walking on two legs. How do we allow ourselves to think creatively and very deadly seriously about transforming the most powerful system in the history of the world? So I toss that to you for the next hot potato, and let's have fun with it. Thank you very much.
All right, Gar, why don't you stay up there on the stage and take a seat. And Andrew, we're expecting a live transmission from the White House in about 11 minutes. So we'll begin with a couple of questions for you. We're filling time, as they say in the network, or filibustering, as they say at CNN, which we did for about 6 weeks on the missing plane. We could talk about the missing plane, but I'd rather not. I think we can move on to something more important. So here's my question. You see a fundamental systemic problem, and you imply we're sort of marching toward, is it revolution? Is that where we're headed toward?
The term I use in my books, and I think what makes sense, what's interesting about what I suggested is a stalemate, stagnation, and decay scenario, which is where we are, is that unlike a collapse scenario. If it collapsed, you would probably get a revolution to the right. not the left, probably. So I think it is, the term I think is appropriate, evolutionary reconstruction is the redevelopment of new institutions, step by step, practically, and building out from it. It leads, if it works out, it either leads to a change in balance of relationships or ultimately longer-term transformation.
All right, so does that jive with a pivot? And do you guys agree or disagree?
Well, it's a really good question. As I sat there thinking about it, what you're saying is a lot like Naomi Klein's new book on basically, climate change is so big that, we need to take apart capitalism. I don't think I'm actually saying anything different, but I guess the question I have is, and I was at the march, and I'm there with a couple companies, almost everybody at the march was carrying "down with capitalism, down with companies" kind of banners, and I kept thinking, and replace it with what? And I think you have some of those answers, but I guess the big pivot to me is a very deep change in how business works, but I'm not sure that capitalism, is necessarily needs to be overthrown, because to me it's a set of tools. The use of markets, the use of pricing, the matching of goods and services. And because we've used tools badly or not as well as we could doesn't mean, it's like taking a hammer and saying, well, I took it and banged the wall, but you were banging with the sharp end on the back and poking holes in the wall. Like, that doesn't mean, you were using it wrong, right? So I think we get the prices right. Like, a price on carbon is one of the key things that needs to happen. You start to use capitalism towards the right ends. And I don't think we need to overthrow the whole system. I really don't.
So it seems to me capitalism works well when there is some element of government regulation.
There has to be.
Accurate to say, right?
Yeah,
and we've seen since the Reagan era at least, a steady decline in government intervention, and that you could take that to the Great Crash most recently, right?
So I come from that school. That's what we used to do in the Senate when I worked there. We actually could get effective regulation. What has changed is you can't get effective regulation.
Right.
The power relationships have shifted. That's the big change. Or put it another way, social democracy has decayed in America with liberalism, which is I come out of. I'm a Wisconsin liberal.
But isn't it about to me the thing that has to change.
And you say that in public these days. Good for you. Rock on,
because the same thing you described that's going on with new economy or new systems is happening with tackling climate change as well. The only activities at the state and local level, like the federal's broken, right? So this election to me was, from a climate perspective, almost meaningless, because, oh no, they're not going to do anything in the Senate about climate. They weren't doing it anyways, right? So I think the state and local is where you'll see it, but to me, the federal system problem we have, isn't it about the money? That's the money, and I actually think we need a constitutional convention. Like, I think the system we need to overthrow is our governance system. I think it's completely screwed up now, and these guys are raising. Have you seen the numbers on how much you have to raise now to keep running for office, right?
Well, and where are they getting the money from? The very corporations that we're talking about, the very corporations which are pursuing actively deregulation, and so they're running our country. They're taking control.
Absolutely.
That's
but corporations are people too, right? Who said
people.
that? Yeah.
They're people.
But that is the problem. There is a governance system, a government design. The Constitution is, we're allowed to say this. It's a rickety old constitutional design which was designed to get stalemated, and has its own internal flaws. That any political scientist who studies it knows it's very, very much. But to do what you're saying, who controls the Constitutional Convention, given the power relationships we now have? So if you opened up the constitutional question at this point, what you'd probably get is a worse constitution from the point of view of the values of the people in this room. So it's about institutional power that's changed. And if I had to say, as I said, the one thing that's changed most in this past period, and why the trends keep going south, that's the test. Keep looking at the trends, because they tell you what's really going on. What's changed most is that the American labor movement has collapsed. Partly it's been beaten up and collapsed, but it's collapsing all over the world. The predictions of OECD is that in Sweden, the premier social democratic country, in 30 years we'll have the same income distribution as the United States. So things are going on this way all over the world as labor collapses. And the question is whether you think that's going to go on forever, or whether or not the kinds of reactions that are just beginning over the last decade and a half will begin to develop, and from the bottom up, that kind of question. That's the hot potato that people really haven't wanted to struggle with. But what we're finding, surprisingly, the guy at Davos said the same thing 2 years ago. The problem is capitalism. Can it survive? Same as these business guys at the Academy of Management. Right. I was amazed to be asked to speak on that subject, but their whole kind of portfolio was about what's really going on here, at least facing the questions.
Well, and I'll give you one example from right here that I love to use to kind of shock people. So down the road at Harvard, there's a professor, Rebecca Henderson, I'm sure people know, or a lot of people know, and she started a class called Reimagining Capitalism, right? And I use this in the book, and I say, she started it and thought there'd be a few dozen people, it's an elective, and 400 kids signed up.
Yep.
So half the graduating class of Harvard, which is the most mainstream business school, wants to reimagine capitalism.
Exactly.
That to me says there is a deep change coming. So I don't think it's surprising they're asking these questions, because there's serious failings underpinning the way we're doing it. But it's about, are we using the tools correctly, I think, because I don't know what we'd be replacing it with.
Well, that's exactly right. Rebecca's part of it. I've been talking to Rebecca as well about some of this. But that is the question. See, even to put it, just as you say, I don't know what we'd replace it with. Right. It's a damn good question. Right. And that's what the discussion's beginning to be about. What can we learn from the Mondragon, which is 80,000 and some very, very large enterprise? What can we learn from these little things? What can we learn from some of the European experience? Asking it exactly that way, practically. What can we learn? How do you build? Would it make sense or not? Rather, no rhetoric. Let's drop the rhetoric. What is the design that you would like that would achieve democracy, equality, community, ecological sustainability? What does that look like? And how do you ask that, the way the Founding Fathers did, if you like? I mean, they asked those kind of questions very, very intensely. And the spirit is the spirit of what I heard, the experimentation that's been discussed here. We heard wonderful things going on all over the country. It's opening up that spirit. If you like that wonderful talk about the young girls in architecture, these are architecture problems, systemic architecture. What is the design that would work, and can we think it through? Can we build it from the bottom up? And even if you don't get to Jerusalem, you might actually do some good on the way, no matter what. So it's a pretty good inquiry even on the way. Anyway, that's the spirit we're seeing. One of the things I should say about this, it's kind of obvious, but maybe we can say it to the TV producers. There is no local reporting, virtually, in the United States. That is to say, if you look at what happens in a city, the newspapers don't have money to provide for local reporting on what I'm talking about. So it's below the horizon even to find it. I'll give you one website, community-wealth, put the dash in, which kind of covers the waterfront on the experimentation that's going on. But you won't find it because the reporting isn't there in most parts of the country. You don't get the sense of the richness of what's happening in many, many parts of the country.
So, Gar, you really did harsh my buzz with all that litany. I'm telling you, I was so optimistic, and then you came up there and you read, we're number 21 in almost everything.
That's right.
So how do we, it seems to me there was a time in this country, Henry Ford at the $5 a day, right? He unilaterally said, it was a double or triple the wage, because he said, it might be good if we had people out there who could afford to buy the car they're making. Right. Mm-hmm. So now we have 70 million people in poverty. We have the 1% acquiring all this wealth. How do we, it does make good sense to have some consumers out there to sustain the Gulf Streams. And so what do we forget along the way, and how do we teach these rather smart, rich people that this is a good idea?
Well, I think probably some of the corporate leaders you're talking, and the more advanced and creative guys, understand this and are not. They're on the right side of the angels.
They're shackled by the short-termism. I mean, go ahead. But this wage thing is the perfect example.
And you're just talking about the quarterly.
Let's put it this way:
the treadmill they're on to report quarterly and show earnings. Otherwise, they get fired by the board.
Because so think about the guys who know. So you mentioned Henry Ford. I use that example all the time. He doubled the wage. If you are the CEO of Walmart or McDonald's, you know that you depend on a thriving middle class for your existence. These are smart guys. Right. But they can't go out and say, I'm going to double wages, because the stock price will get hit and their options will go down. I mean, they're shackled by having to respond to analysts.
I wonder if Walmart did that. Would their stock price really go down?
It would immediately, but the question is, does it come back? Because Pullman...
I wonder if somebody took that kind of courageous statement.
Paul Pullman at Unilever, he came in and he said, I'm not talking to Wall Street every quarter. I'm going to build long-term value. The stock went down 4% immediately, but it went back up. It's called leadership, right? There's not a lot of that.
Some people call it stones. Why doesn't somebody grow them, And really.
Absolutely.
Because I think if somebody were to, in that kind of a position, were to take that kind of a leadership role, I think it might turn things around, but it is incumbent upon individuals at the top, and I don't see a lot of that.
My sense is, and I wonder how you feel about it, there are some who are willing to do that, but it's a very small percentage of the game because they're shackled for the reasons we're talking about.
Business has gotten very, very conservative, little c, like very careful, especially since the recession. They are Everybody's acting like they have no money. They're sitting on $3 trillion in cash. Everybody's acting like the shoe will drop because they get fired every minute. And there is no stones. I don't know why. There's this fear. There's a lot of fear.
This is not personal. This is systemic. That's a systemic design. That's what I'm talking about.
Right. They need venues that come together and be safe. Davos provides that sometimes for the world leaders. They can go and have their cocktails and be safe amongst each other, but they have to agree together. Yeah. And there's some of this going on. There's some really interesting partnerships happening across companies, across value chains to try to solve systemic problems. It is happening. Like there's something called the Closed Loop Fund that just got started, $100 million with Walmart, Unilever, Pepsi, and others to try to fix the holes in municipal waste collection so they can hit their zero waste targets. I think that shows that there's a huge lack in what we're spending as a community, because there's something we have for doing communal projects. It's called government. And when we keep defunding it, then you're left with companies having to fund waste collection. I think that's ridiculous. Pretty soon they're going to fund police like they did in RoboCop or something. I mean, it's like, it's absurd, but they're coming together to do it because they have to, right? Because the gap is there. So I think there's innovative stuff happening.
Yep, there are, I totally agree. There are some companies that are doing that. It's a sliver. No.
Yep. All right, so do we have any quick question from the audience here? We have one in the back there, if we can get a microphone there, and then we'll dial in Washington and see what's going on there. We're going to go right to the source of the problem.
I wondered if you could talk about the role of local self-reliance, like these separate economic models, like in Great Barrington, where they're trying to have currency and bank, and then maybe Samso, where they were this island that was able to get off fossil fuel. So are there any more examples like that of local self-reliance, and could that serve as models for where we're going, especially in this world with climate change, where we'll have this disruption and people are going to have their own local food and maybe have their own local economies?
Yeah, we heard something about, we don't have time to go into it, and that's why I gave you that website. We heard something about what's going on in food, which is exploding around the country. Very interesting things going on. And some things going on with different energy and some currency experimentation. Some of it very interesting, some of it pretty shoddy. So you have to look carefully at it. But just below the surface, this is hot stuff all over the country right now at the experimental level. And what's interesting to me is it's happening at the idea level in sophisticated people, not, very sophisticated questions are being asked. So come in, and I think there's a convergence. I was going to say the game-changing, I don't like the word game-changing. So this is my final comment. Because I think we're talking about an evolutionary process in which there's lots and lots and lots of games built up and development, and that's the perspective of whether or not we can actually lay groundwork. Now, the good news is all this stuff is positive no matter what. All these experiments are good to do.
If we're 21st, we can only go up. Right?
Yeah, we can only go up.
That's a good point.
Or we need to add another country to the OECD. Can we put Latvia or something in?
He's absolutely right. Yeah. We can only go up, but the good stuff is positive no matter what, and that's the positive of all this. Yep.
All right. Let's see if we got. Do we have Washington dialed in? Hi, Jen. You there?
Should we come off stage, or should we?
No, I think we'll just sit here. Yeah.
We'll stay.
I don't know. Are we going to do their PowerPoint? So maybe we should, huh?
Very briefly.
Yeah. All right. So why don't you be seated?
Sure.
Hi, Jen, and we'll, as soon as she's up, we'll.
Just introduce her as.
Yes, Ai-jen Poo is obviously she's a MacArthur Genius Fellow recently, so she's a pretty smart person, but everybody is. And today, she is the director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the co-director of Caring Across Generations campaign. She is a strong and strident voice for a sector of the economy, a sector of our society that doesn't have much of a voice. And she is going to talk to us now about the importance of that. Is she with us now? Any word? We're plugging in an iPhone, attaching baling wire. Hi, Jen, you there? All right, just give it a minute. Okay, and so the understudy to Ai-jen Poo is Rainey Aronson, who's in the wings waiting for her big break. This could be it. She's going to be a big star after this one. You too could be at the White House, Rainey, if only you. Have you been rehearsing? Do you want to? You've been listening? Oh, yeah. Okay, she's going to read the speech. I do hear a phone ringing, though. That's a good sign. Hello, White House switchboard. Can I help you?
Hello?
Is this Hi, Jen?
Yes, hi.
Hey, you're on the line with 400 of your dearest and nearest. Thank you for being with us. This is Miles. I've already introduced you. And we have a PowerPoint that is queued up with a person in a yellow T-shirt. So fire away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for
We hear you really. Yep, it's great. It's great.
Great. Wonderful. Marlene is, hopefully you can see her up on the screen. She's originally from Barbados. She's a mother, a grandmother, and works as a caregiver in New York City. She loves the work that she does. She loves people. She loves seeing how people change when you show them care and provide them with attention that only a caregiver can provide. She particularly loves the challenge of bringing older people out of their shell, as she describes, helping them move past their fears. She always tells the story of Dr. Morris Steiner, a retired physician in Brooklyn who became fearful of going outside in his older years. After a few months with Marlene, he was not only going for walks in the neighborhood, but he was attending family weddings and bar mitzvahs. Her care allowed him to not only be more connected to the world, but even to his own family. Marlene's been doing domestic work for longer than I've been alive. She's really seen it all, wonderful employers and bad ones. And I know one thing that really breaks her heart is how undervalued caregivers and domestic workers are in our society. She knows what a difference, sometimes a life and death difference, her work makes in the lives of people like Dr. Steiner and his entire family. That's why she could never accept the treatment that domestic workers and caregivers receive, where the average wages are under $10 per hour. They're excluded from some of the most basic labor protections and work without benefits. So it turns out the workforce that we count on to take care of our families are so undervalued that they can't take care of their own. Next slide. Marlene felt so strongly about this that she started organizing with other domestic workers and caregivers to win respect and rights in the state of New York, a domestic workers' bill of rights. There were many days that she got up at 4 a.m. and packed thermoses of hot coffee and Bajan food and took the number 4 train from Flatbush, Brooklyn to Union Square, where she would join the rest of us on a 6 a.m. bus to Albany. And I could always count on Marlene to bring some extra hot coffee and some home-cooked food for that journey. 7 years she did those bus rides to tell her story to legislators. And after nearly 7 years, she and the over 200,000 domestic workers in New York won their Bill of Rights. Now there are 4 states that have passed legislation, most recently the state of Massachusetts, where all of you are. So thanks to the efforts of women like Marlene and the women that you see in this slide, some historic progress is being made in securing basic minimum protections for this workforce. But it's actually not enough. And I'll tell you why. Next slide. Let me introduce you to my grandmother. She played a heavy role in raising me, teaching me my values, teaching me most things that I find useful today as an adult, including potty training. It turned out that that was quite useful, giving me wise counsel in hard times ever since I can remember. She raised 3 children of her own and helped to raise my sister and I. She lived through a tough childhood in rural poverty, 2 wars, and displacement from her homeland. And she lived through it all to become a trained nurse by profession, which she did for most of her life. Today, she's 88 years old, and she still lives in her own apartment in California, the same apartment she shared with my grandfather before he passed away. She's active. She attends church twice per week, and she sings in the senior church choir. She goes on at least 2 walks in the neighborhood per day, meets her friends for tea, gets her hair done every Saturday at noon, and plays mahjong as often as humanly possible. She's able to do all of this because she has the wonderful support of a home care worker named Mrs. Sun. And Mrs. Sun has become really a key part of the caring support team that allows my grandmother, who took care of so many of us, to live life on her own terms at 88 years old. So Marlene's story is also personal to me and my own family. I count on Mrs. Sun to ensure that my own personal heroine, my grandmother, has the quality of life that she deserves. I can't imagine a more important job, honestly. Next slide. Now, some of us spend a lot of time thinking about the racial demographic changes that are happening in our country today. It's one of the big mega trends that people talk about defining the future of politics in America. And 2040 is the year that is predicted that we'll become a majority-minority nation. Well, there's another demographic shift that's happening as well. It turns out my grandmother is part of the fastest-growing age demographic in the nation, 87 and older. Because of advances in healthcare and technology, people are living longer than ever. This is Eve. She's 82 and still enjoys surfing on a daily basis. Not only are people living longer, they're living vibrant, active lives for longer. And the other dimension of this is that the baby boom generation is joining the ranks of the 65 and older at a rate of 10,000 people per day. That's 4 million people per year turning 65 in America. Some people call it the silver tsunami. We call it the elder boom because it's directly related to the baby boom generation. Whatever you call it, there's absolutely no question it's happening. We're living longer than ever before, much longer than we ever expected or prepared for. Next slide. Now, as more of us get older, more of us are thinking about how we want to live as we get older. And it turns out that we actually know quite a bit about that. We know from a recent AARP report that 90% of Americans prefer aging at home over nursing homes. And multi-generational families are more and more common. In fact, according to the construction industry, the hottest trend in home redesign is the construction of the mother-in-law suite, it's called. And this generation of grandchildren is more connected to their grandparents than any other generation in history. In fact, 7.1 million grandparents have their grandchildren living with them. By 2020, the number of grandparents in America will leap from 65 million to 80 million grandparents. Next slide. On some very fundamental level, older people who want to live active, independent lives for longer require more care and support in the home. If people want to age in place, we've got to actually create the infrastructure for that to happen. As a result of this growing need, home care has naturally become the fastest growing occupation in the nation. Home care, the fastest growing occupation in the nation. 10, 15, 20 years from now, the pressure will be exponentially worse. By 2030, at least 27 million Americans will be in need of care. So it turns out we're going to need millions more Mrs. Suns and Marlenes, millions more caregivers. Family caregivers simply won't be enough. They will continue to play a key role, but it simply won't be enough. And we just have no real system in place to support the millions of Americans who will need home care. And as we talked about earlier, we can barely sustain the workforce we have in place with the current conditions. Low wages, can't get enough hours or work too many hours, can't pay the bills, can't get sick days or benefits, on top of the emotional stress and isolation of caring for people with dementia or grieving the loss of the person you spent day in and day out with for years sometimes. over and over again with the passing of each person that you care for. The best caregivers end up leaving this work all the time due to burnout from the outrageously hard working conditions. Next slide. On the other end of it, families and individuals are struggling to find the care they need. Medicaid-supported hours of care are often not enough, even when they are available, and millions of working families who need care don't actually meet the income requirements for Medicaid. So for the millions of middle-class, hardworking families out there, there are no real options for affordable home care. I'm sure many of us in this room have struggled with this. We either can't find the right caregiver, or we can't afford long-term care insurance, or the insurance that we have doesn't cover what we actually need, or we don't even have the time to manage the responsibilities and the paperwork on top of our careers and caring for our own children. All of us are feeling this pressure in some way, and it's something we talk about in private at our kitchen tables, something we often blame ourselves for, that we maybe didn't save enough or we didn't move to take care of our loved ones ourselves. But the truth is, it's more than any of us can bear alone, simply more than any one of us can bear alone. We simply don't have the system in place to support the needs of today's American families. It's a national issue, and it should be a national priority. And herein lies the opportunity. Next slide. Now, while all this that I've laid out sounds somewhat grim, and the notion of a tsunami, a silver tsunami, makes it seem like some kind of apocalyptic natural disaster, it's actually quite the opposite. It's a huge opportunity to address many of the problems with caregiving today in one solution that brings us together as a nation. In fact, the problems come together to solve one another. What if all of us who are struggling with managing, providing, or receiving care were to come together to change the way that we take care of each other in America? What if we took our private struggles and pain and made them a national policy priority? And what if we called upon our elected leaders to invest in our care and the infrastructure to provide it? What if we called upon them to create more care jobs, to make them good jobs, and to make better quality, affordable care accessible to every home in America? Good jobs, good care, choice and accessibility, affordable care for all. One vision with many dimensions supporting quality of life for our loved ones and the workers who care for them, for all of us. Next slide. In the midst of so much change and diversity in this country, we've actually found something that connects us all, and it's care. By making care a national priority, we can bring care to every home in America. Just like we brought electricity and the internet to every home in America, we can bring the choice to receive quality care to every home. Whether you're a senior or a home care worker or a family caregiver or a grandchild, you can connect to the significance of the caregiving relationship in this moment. We really are in this one together, and by investing in our caregiving relationships, we can actually make life better for all of us. So what does this mean? Next slide. It means that we can create jobs, transform the fastest growing job in the nation into a good job with a pathway to more opportunity from one generation to the next. We calculated that we need at least 2 million new jobs in home care in the next 10 years. It costs anywhere from $60,000 to $90,000 per year to live in a nursing home, for one person to live in a nursing home. Home care is also a much more economical alternative. And just like we transformed manufacturing jobs in the 1920s and 30s from dangerous sweatshop jobs to good jobs with real economic security, we can do the same here with care jobs. And when we do, it will mean that one of the largest segments of working poor women in our economy will be lifted out of poverty together with their families, helping to turn the tide on the severe economic inequality that defines our economy today. And it will mean that millions of working families will have real choices when it comes to meeting their family caregiving needs. Rather than having to choose between work and family, we can trust that there are professionals in place to support each of us across generations. Next slide. So, by accounting for investing in home care, we can bring respect and dignity to everyone in the caregiving relationship. Next slide. And it is about relationships. At the end of the day, so much turns on the caregiving relationship. We're already connected by the need for care. We've just not adequately invested in that relationship or really valued it for its true worth in our society. For a long time, we've just assumed that someone in the family, usually a woman, will take care of it. We ourselves will do it. We're a do-it-yourself kind of culture. Or someone, usually a woman of color or immigrant, will do it for very little pay. But the reality is that the cost of not accounting for the true value of the caregiving relationship and the extent of what the work really entails has been a heavy cost that has been borne by all of us. And the opportunity here is to transform that, to create a home care system that supports strong caregiving relationships so that each of us can preserve our dignity through the life cycle of a family. Next slide. At the end of the day, this nation is a really bold experiment in democracy. We are the most diverse democracy in the world. We're so diverse, and yet there is still much that we share, all of us. And care is one of those things that enhances the values that we share, that can bring us together across lines of race, class, and generation. We do, as a nation, believe in family and the importance of a sense of home and community. Care, particularly home care, is the place where all of these interests of today's diverse constituencies in America come together. Whether we're thinking about the African American or the new immigrant home care worker in need of real economic security for her family, or the aging white senior in Ohio who's in need of support to age in place, or the family caregiver in Boston searching for help in managing care for her parent on top of her work and child care responsibilities. An investment in our caregiving infrastructure meets all of our interests and actually braids our stories together. I wrote a book about these stories and these connections called The Age of Dignity, Preparing for the Elder Boom in a Changing America. It's coming out on the New Press in January of 2015, and the book argues that care is the thread that can help us weave a new story about who we are and who we're becoming as a nation. And investing in our caregiving infrastructure is our unique generational opportunity to strengthen the fabric of a changing, diverse America. I hope you'll check it out, and I thank you so much for allowing me to participate today.
Thank you, Ai-jen. Hey, how's the trip to Washington? Are you there still?
I am. I can't hear you very well.
Yeah,
though.
so what did you say to the president today?
I'm sorry?
Does anybody have any way is there any way she can hear me, or?
I'm so sorry. I can't hear very well.
Okay. All right. Well, we won't belabor the point. Boy, leaving us in suspense. You want to just tell her? Ask her. We all want to know, inquiring minds.
Oh, I told him thank you. I told him thank you and that we're ready to take this step forward for our democracy together. Yeah.
All right, good. Thank you very much. We appreciate you dialing in. That was excellent. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, we're at the conclusion here. I think we've accomplished a lot. You know, I feel like I have been in a parallel universe today. I just thought I'd see what the headlines were on CNN.com today, just to see. Let's see. There's the winter storm, of course. A little more on the winter storm. Oh, one more thing on the winter storm. U2's Bono fell off his bike. Bill Crosby, that's unfortunate, more of that. But about 4 stories on that. Your smartphone is a pain in the neck. That's a story. Let's see. What else do we have? A stranded nurse helped deliver a baby. A dog nearly chewed off his paw to escape. So that's the that's the mainstream news diet, folks. I think I saw a lot of stories here that aren't being covered very well. What do you think? And I think it's kind of unfortunate that it's not more. I feel like we're not even talking about the right things in our common discourse. And when I talk to smart people and listen to smart people like I have today, and they bring out the issues that really we should be concerned about and some of the problems which we should be focusing on, and of course some of the suggestions on how to do something about it. I think, what can I do about that? And what I can do, and what many of us in this room have, is the ability to use our roles as providing a megaphone for some of these ideas. So I have a few ideas I'd like to work on, and I hope all of you feel the same way. That is the goal, and who knows, this might make a few good films or a few good pieces on the NewsHour, or who knows what. But let's try to collectively, I think we can all vow to at least try to change the agenda and the discourse in our nation. I think that would be a worthy conclusion to all of our efforts sitting here today. But I hope you enjoyed it. I did very much. Some thanks. And by the way, I think there's some wine in the atrium. Is there wine? Yeah, okay. But don't drink and drive. Thank you so much, Kendeda Fund. Is Diane Ives still here? Diane Ives, stand up. Take a bow. It's 4 years running. We're going to do a 5th? Are you on the hook for a 5th? Should we do it right now? Just do it. Just do it. Yep. I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah, no, actually, I do want to put you on the spot. Kara Miller, stand up. Thank you. Take a bow. Excellent work. She's nationwide, coast to coast with her program. Make sure you listen for it. And, of course, Linda Harrer, please stand up. She's really the genius behind all this. Along with Carolyn Gallmeyer, Carolyn Lee, and Christina Ventresca. Close? Good? Okay. Excellent work to all of you. Thank you so much. And, of course, the production crew. Give it up for the production crew who figured out how to make an iPhone work for the presentation. That was good. That was very MacGyver-esque. But thank you for your time. Really, thank you for listening. Go have a glass of wine, and we'll see you next year.